Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 14th of May, 2024, and you are joining me today for another live stream where we are going to be looking at the various different events that have taken place over the last few days, or indeed few hours, and we'll be taking some questions as always and looking at some follow-up from yesterday's program on multipolarity, China, Russia, etc. So we will begin by doing the customary greetings to those who are in the chat thus far. So we have Banana Bender, who's with us and who is already inside tomorrow. And we have Rupert and also Davey, who joins us from Wales. And Lee is with us and says good evening. Martin, good afternoon to you. Seabolt, good evening to you. Not a Pacifist is happy to finally catch a live stream. Scheduling announcements in just a moment. Gonzalo joins us from Madrid. Hello to Slava in Chicago. And I believe I'm right in saying happy birthday for the other day. Zuleika joins us on X or Twitter. Good to have you with us. Colchesterian is with us. Michael asks a question about Hungary and Palestine UN membership. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Irish Partisan joins us from Minsk and says, just getting ready for bed. Good to have you with us, even if briefly. Jawad is with us, as is Mary. Carlos joins us coming to us from Nicaragua and says, good afternoon. Boyo joins us from London. Lucas says, good evening, friends. The only way the US have to save the reputation of its puppets is the Eurovision. Well, I don't know if winning Eurovision could really save anybody's reputation anymore. Have you taken a look at it? My God. I caught like 30 seconds as I was going across the room the other day, and it looked like some sort of carnival-esque freak show. Right, so we'll begin by picking up on questions. So Michael asks, why does Hungary vote against Palestine UN membership? Because Orban is a reactionary and a supporter of Zionism. It's not a particularly complicated answer. I mean, it's complicated in a way because Orban has this reputation for being if not favorable to Russia, then at least not hostile, and continuing to do business with the Russians. And of course, Hungary has very extensive, as was shown in the, I believe it was the 17 agreements signed just last week, very extensive trade and scientific and cultural relations with China. So for them to be all in on supporting Israel seems at first glance to be inconsistent. But Orban's chopped and changed his beliefs on a number of things, but he's remained a supporter of Zionism. And let's be clear, Orban is a reactionary, just like Erdogan is a reactionary, just like the leaders of Thailand are reactionaries, the leaders of Myanmar are reactionaries. All these countries might play varying roles in terms of their relationship with US imperialism. It doesn't make the leaders of them any less reactionary. So we should always be clear about that. And as I say, Orban, it's something that he's been consistent on, even if he's changed his beliefs on a number of other questions. He's smart enough to know which way the wind is blowing on big issues like economics and patterns of trade, etc. But let's also not forget that the man is something of a racist as well. He's happy to do trade with just about anybody, but he has apparently a deep prejudice against the Arab population of the world, and that shows up as well. So he's a supporter of Western colonialism in that case. Will he stay so till the bitter end? Well, if it goes really bad for the Israelis, he's enough of an opportunist to bail out and change course. But for now, he remains in the same set of reactionary beliefs that he's always had. And as do the bulk of the Hungarian bourgeois. I mean, support for Israel comes with the package of anti-communism as well. And remember, Orban's still an ardent anti-communist for all of his relations and positive words to say about the PRC. he's still a vehement anti-communist. So this is fairly easily explained once you understand the contradictions in Orban's position. Boyo says, just read a headline about Israeli government admitting to manipulating Eurovision results. Yes, that's hilarious. Slava says, Ukraine won Eurovision 3 times, 2004, 2014, and 2022. Guess why? Could it be the sheer quality of the music, Slava? No, it's not, of course. I mean, these things are always stitched up. Freak Unique says, good evening, comrades from Congleton, Cheshire. Good to have you with us, a fellow northwest of England resident. Lucas says, there is a big Jewish community in Hungary. Could this have an impact? I don't think it does. I think that the bigger impact is that, again, Orban, as a dedicated anti-communist and a reactionary, took up the cause of Israel partially for those reasons, partially for reasons of real chauvinism against the Arabs and Muslims in particular. And yeah, he maintains that. Could it be that there are some big-time Zionists in Hungary who he's politically connected with? Well, maybe. I don't know that, though. I think mainly it's just that it's something that he's stuck with. I think he has a political relationship with Netanyahu as well. So that could have something to do with it. But I think the biggest thing is that it all stems from his anti-communism and, quite frankly, the man's racism as well. We'll see if he sticks to it, if the situation continues to deteriorate for the Zionists. Tony Blinken for Eurovision. Oof. If you've not seen it yet, then Tony Blinken, as Irish Partisan says, was performing, quite frankly, terrible version of Neil Young's "Rocking in the Free World." Now, I'm staggered sometimes by the crassness and the idiocy of these people. Like, leave aside for a moment the fact that Neil Young is clearly an out-of-touch, rich reactionary these days. Let's just leave that aside. If you listen to the lyrics of "Rockin' in the Free World," it's condemnatory towards the United States. It's a bitter song. It's an ironic song. It's also very sarcastic. And what it says is, like, you keep on rocking in a free world, and it says, it talks about junkies on the streets and homeless people and poverty and deprivation. I will spare you my version of it, done without guitar, because but even though it would be better than Tony Blinken's, but go away and listen to the original song. I think on the album there's an acoustic version and an electric version. Go and listen to the electric version. Also, Neil Young, again, to be fair, has done some very good live versions of it. So the song lyrics are clear in that it's a statement of condemnation of the hypocrisies of the so-called free world. The same with Bruce Springsteen's "Born in the USA." Now, again, Springsteen, like all these rock stars, is now just a completely out-of-touch old reactionary who's doing fucking podcasts with Barack Obama. I mean, my God. But you listen to the lyrics of "Born in the USA," it's no doubt what that song means. It's pretty clear, which is it's a song that, again, is bitterly ironic about the USA. It's from the perspective of a broken down, traumatized Vietnam veteran who can't find work, who's living in poverty. And "Born in the USA" is sung with a sneer. It's sung with bitterness. But of course, the Reagan campaign in the early 80s listened to that and said, "Oh, that chorus sounds great." And so Tony Blinken, I mean, this is the crassness and stupidity of the man. He goes to Kiev and he sings this. I mean, I made the comment on Twitter that at least Nero had the decency to be a good musician when he fiddled whilst Rome burnt around him. I'm not sure how true that story is, but certainly it's a powerful image. Tony Blinken played a song which is again, condemning the system which he lives to defend, regardless of Neil Young's later trajectory. And he goes and plays it in a city, namely Kiev, that he and those like him, the servants of the US imperialism, have worked flat out to destroy, really, for the last 30 years, certainly since 2004. And they've worked constantly to pitch it into a war against the Russians, which they hoped would trigger a regime change operation in Russia itself. And now that this is all going wrong, you've got the breakthroughs of the Russians in Donbass, and of course, so the advance into Kharkov region, and the whole thing's falling apart. There's more and more videos now of Ukrainian men running away, resisting the press gang. One Ukrainian blew himself up with a grenade, and the press gang recruiter guy blew himself up rather than be taken into the army. So this is like what's unfolding there, and has been for a long time now, is a horror. And Tony Blinken's there belting out frankly, a really shit version of Rockin' in the Free World. I mean, fucking hell, I haven't touched a guitar in 7 or 8 years, and I could do a better job than that. It's like it's insane. It's a real, like, and I know we have a tendency to fall into this, like it's like looking for symbols of the end of the US empire, but that's real end of empire stuff. That's like, I mean, if you remember, to go to venture into film criticism for a moment, if you think of like Apocalypse Now, especially like the Redux version that was released 20 years ago, and as Willard, played by Martin Sheen, travels upriver, and of course things get more demoralized and desperate and degenerated until you get like the scene with the Playboy girls jumping out of a helicopter and doing this like dance show on stage, which just sort of collapses when the soldiers rush the stage to try and get at the women, and they have to be evacuated by a helicopter. I mean, even Francis Ford Coppola's enhanced imagination at the time couldn't have imagined something as perverse as like Tony Blinken doing this sort of lame rock out number in some club in Kiev, as the country he has worked so hard to turn into a charnel house falls apart around him. It's astonishing. I mean, the only thing that would have made it worse is if Bono had joined him on stage, which maybe he did. I don't know. I only saw a 30-second clip. The CIA playbook in Georgia, says David Matthew. Yes, we'll be returning to that in a moment. Yep X says, can you make playlists for your live streams based on topics and so forth? Yes, I will be doing some announcements about organization in just a moment. Blinken in jail, says David Matthew. Good point. Putin's shirt says, I just learned that Zionism started with the Ukrainian Jews. I'm not sure that's correct. I mean, it depends where you want to start the history of Zionism. Do we want to start the history of Zionism with, like, the World Zionist Congress and things like that in the later 19th century? Or is it more appropriate to go back even earlier to look at British Christian Zionism, which was why, or one of the reasons why, part of the reason why the British government was so keen on Zionism as an idea, and the fact that Zionism in various different forms has been part of dominant forms of British Protestantism since the 17th century. So I'm not sure that that's correct, that it started with Ukrainian Jews. I mean, it started with in the form that, you know, people like Herzl developed it into. It started with Central and Eastern European Jews, but it's always stems from a longer Christian tradition. Slava says Blinken was jamming while the whole country of Ukraine is going through electric shutdowns. Yeah, I mean, so they rerouted power so Tony Blinken could murder a Neil Young song. Michael is right that Blinken can't play guitar. He can't fucking sing either. Potted Rodent says, I just watched 10 seconds of Blinken's Free World. Now I hate music. David Matthews says, maybe he has a keen sense of irony. I doubt it. Tony Blinken doesn't look like a man who has a sense of humor, to be honest. Good evening to Beiju. Good to have you with us, comrade. Kevin joins us from Sligo. I wonder what Dylan thinks of genocide now he's 80 plus. Well, Dylan has been a Zionist for at least 40 years. If you listen to, I think it's an album from the middle 80s, where Dylan did a song called Neighborhood Bully. Just type in Bob Dylan Neighborhood Bully on YouTube, it'll come up. And you listen to that, and that's all about his like profession of love for the great misunderstood country of Israel. So yeah, he's been a he's been a reactionary probably forever. I mean, it doesn't mean that some of the music of the man isn't great, but no one should ever have taken Dylan seriously when it come to politics, to be honest. His allegiances have always shifted more easily than money out of a fraudster's bank account. Bart joins us from Ontario, Canada. Yes, good to have you with us. So, just a couple of business announcements before we get into the meat of things. The time slot for programs in the week is going to be as follows. So, on Mondays, there's going to be a program from 4 o'clock in the afternoon onwards. So that's 4 p.m. British time, because I've got appointments in the evening then. The rest of the week, it's going to be programs in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday will be always starting at 10:30. So that's 10:30 Tuesday to Friday. And then what I'll be doing at the weekends is I'll be doing the Patreon streams at the weekend from now on. So that's Monday to Friday live streams on here, and then Patreon stream at the weekend. So regularizing the time slot, because I realized I'd been sort of bouncing around the place, and now I'm in a position where I can keep it in a regular time slot. I'll be sure to do so. So you can schedule that into your diaries on a more reliable basis going forward. So Dr. Fu Manchu says, good evening from EU Capo land, where the left tells you the proletariat doesn't exist. Well, the left in Britain was basically saying many of the same things. But then again, who wants to have anything to do with the established left? I mean, in the west of Europe or Britain or the United States. It went rotten after World War II and is now dying or dead already. So quite frankly, fuck it. Good evening to Battle Cossack, who has joined us. So let's carry on and start talking about what we are going to be covering this evening. So I'm just moving my notes around. So I mentioned before the Russian Kharkov offensive, which is a advance into the area around Kharkov, which was an area that was under the control of the Russians until autumn of 2022, an area they took early on in the advance, the rapid advances in the early days of the special military operation. And this was the great victory, in heavily inverted commas, won by the Ukrainians in I think it was September 2022, when how it's presented in the West, at least, is that they pushed the Russians out of the Kharkov region. And since then, it's been controlled by the Ukrainians. There were, of course, reports of war crimes carried out by fascists in the Kharkov region against people who were alleged to be Russian collaborators in the immediate period following the Ukrainian reconquest of those areas. Since then, front line up there has been fairly static. The Russians control some very small areas in that part of the country, but mostly the pre-2022 border remains as it was. Now, the Ukrainians, doubtless under the influence of the British and the United States intelligence agencies, have been launching these cross-border raids into the Belgorod region. They've been shelling including very heavily the Belgorod region, repeatedly over the last few months. And there was a partial collapse of an apartment building in Belgorod itself quite recently, in fact, earlier this week, which killed several people. So the action in that part of the borderland has been rumbling on now for years, ever since the Russian retreat. And it should be emphasized again that the Russian withdrawal from Kharkov in 2022, in September of 2022, was something that, of course, has went down exceedingly badly with the Russian commentators, with various Russian nationalists and communists who accused the government of incompetence, of selling out, of capitulating. And of course, there's elements of truth. It was more the fact that the Russians didn't have enough men to hold this huge front line that they had, hence why they had to consolidate their position, withdraw from part of the Kherson region in the south, withdraw tactically from the Kharkov region to tighten up their front line. And they did so quite successfully with minimal losses. This is the situation that we find ourselves in, which is that, of course, they were claiming this great victory, and they are, of course, wrong about that, which is that they claimed a great victory, said it was a great victory, but in the end were unable to deliver anything. They weren't able to punch through or destabilize the Russian lines anywhere else. The Kiev regime paid a very, very heavy price for that advance. And the whole picture becomes more clear as time goes on, and the advances now that we see into the Kharkov region come from the buildup of Russian forces. Apparently, around the border area where these incursions started, there was around 50,000 troops lined up. Probably not enough to take the city of Kharkov itself, but certainly enough to establish a bridgehead up there. And that's in effect what they are doing. So it's probably not going to be some sort of rapid advance on Kharkov city itself. What they seem to be doing is consolidating their hold up there, slowly advancing into it and stretching Ukrainian resources even further, given that there's the Russian advances up into the Donetsk People's Republic region, which is slowly crawling forward there. They're slowly going forward in Kharkov. They're constantly keeping the pressure on Ukrainian lines. And again, it goes with the tactics that the Russians have been using really since that supposedly successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kharkov region almost 2 years ago, which is that they've been slowly grinding down the Ukrainian forces, again, following the old Clausewitzian method of destroying the fighting capacity of the enemy, which, of course, Clausewitz himself, it must be said, was partially influenced by what he observed from Russian tactics against Napoleon, and that's reflected in his writings. So the advance in the north and the advance in the Donetsk region is all about, again, stretching the Ukrainians, or I should say NATO forces, proxy NATO forces, as far as they can, destroying as much of their fighting capacity as they can. There's talk of more surrenders in the Kharkov region, Ukrainian forces fleeing from villages that they're supposed to defend. And the other big thing that was talked about today was that they are, of course, engaging in recriminations. That is the Ukrainian side. If you look at the Ukrainian leak channels on telegrams, that's Resident, Legitimny, etc. They are all talking about feuds inside the government, recriminations, blame game going on between Zelensky and various other officials, Syrskyi and Budanov blaming each other for what's gone on. But what has come out is that apparently the defenses that were meant to be created up in Kharkov were either not created or constructed very, very poorly, with nothing like the rigor that the Russians did in their building up of the defensive lines in the Zaporozhye region, called the Surovikin line, which were incredibly comprehensive defenses, apparently like at least 4 layers deep. And the Ukrainians got nowhere near penetrating that in their much vaunted counteroffensive from last year. So what was supposed to be built in these amazing new defensive lines wasn't built. What was all the money that was given has either been spent on something else or has been embezzled or just disappeared somewhere into somebody's pocket. And all that was meant to be provided in terms of solid defensive lines just either is inadequate or isn't there. So this is the picture that we have now, which is that the Russians slowly add to the pressure on the Ukrainian lines. More and more casualties are incurred by the Ukrainians. They are unable to replace these casualties in any kind of successful way, because they have lost the overwhelming majority of their experienced and decently trained troops. They've lost huge numbers of officers and non-commissioned officers, i.e. the people who actually do the battlefield commanding. Zelensky and Kuleba and others are complaining that the West didn't send them enough equipment. But as Jacques Beau observes in some interviews he's given, and he's the former Swiss military intelligence officer who wrote the book on the Russian military doctrine, or a book on the Russian military doctrine, I should say. He has observed that, and correctly, it has to be said, it doesn't matter how much equipment that you give them. It doesn't matter how many Western tanks or artillery pieces or multiple launch rocket systems that you give the Ukrainians now. Well, it never really mattered that much, because Russia's capacity to outproduce them was always there. But it doesn't matter what you give them now, because they've lost so many trained men. They've lost so many experienced officers. They don't have the capacity to use the equipment that's given to them in an effective way, because a lot of this stuff that's given to them, and again, you don't have to be some sort of military genius to work this out, like whether it's tanks or artillery pieces or the rocket systems or the drone systems, this is all designed to work as part of an integrated system. So this is one of Jacques Beau's observations, which is undeniably true. Like where it's the Abrams tank, it's the Challenger 2, or the Vampire rocket system, or the drone systems. It's all designed to work in Western armies that have at least parity in the air in terms of air power, who have extensive long-range missile support, who have possibly naval support, and all of this is integrated in theory anyway. We've yet to test this in practice with regard to the whether this works if a Western army is put to the test. But in theory, all of this is meant to be a unified system that operates together. So you take an individual element out of that system. So if you take the Abrams tank out of the system that it's supposed to operate within inside the US military, and you just stick it into Ukraine, or the Challenger tank, or the French Caesar field gun, mobile artillery piece, or anything else, you take it out of the system that it's integrated into and just put it in the field, it might be effective for a little while, but the Russians are going to get wise to it pretty quickly and are going to be able to eliminate it. And as it's not sat in an integrated system where there's all these different moving parts are supposedly brought together under the command of officers who know exactly how to run them, exactly how to make this all work together, how to cover the tanks with air power when they're going into the field, how to protect the infantry adequately, how to do all the different forms of electronic warfare that you need to do on the modern battlefield, and have all that working together in order that these pieces of equipment can actually have any chance of making an impact. So is it any surprise when you just take the Leopard tank, for instance, from Germany, the Leopard 2s, I think it was, put them into a Ukrainian unit and then roll them towards the Russian lines, again, with no air power supporting them, with none of what they would supposedly have. I say supposedly because, again, the Bundeswehr hasn't been tested in action. But let's say in theory that the Leopard 2 tank is integrated into this system that works if it was going into battle as part of a German force. Well, you take it out of that. Is it any surprise, as Jacques Beau correctly observes, that it doesn't work and it gets blown up easily, that the Ukrainians can't use it to maximum effect? Whereas if you look on the Russian side, of course, all of their tanks, their artillery, I know there have been reports that they're still not up to scratch in terms of the level of drones that they're producing, either in numbers or in complexity, and the West is still ahead, perhaps in terms of the quality and the numbers produced there. And this is why Belousov, or part of the reason why Belousov has been brought in to tighten up and improve the production levels there. But the Russian system is able to operate in an integrated fashion because all of their equipment is designed to function in the system which they are able to fully bring to bear, including their air power, including their support, their long-range support, including their ability to withdraw equipment that is damaged from the field and repair it relatively quickly and have it back and serviceable again, because of their ability to withdraw just either over the border into Russia itself or into garages that can repair these things, or workshops inside what's now the Russian territories that used to be Eastern Ukraine. Either way, like the demand for more and more equipment, it doesn't make any sense. It's certainly not going to win you the war. I mean, when you look at it, the demand for more equipment coming from Zelensky and the others in the Ukrainian political hierarchy looks more and more like nothing to do with actual military realities. It's much more to do with political realities. And here we go back again to the misbegotten false promises of Boris Johnson. We'll give you everything you need to win, Vladimir, don't worry about it. And Zelensky, I think, and Yermak, he's the Svengali figure who sort of operates behind him, or possibly a Rasputin figure, who knows. Zelensky's political survival has been pegged to him being the man who can deliver money and weapons. Money, well, we know where, we don't know, but we suspect where a lot of that has been drained off to. I mean, Zelensky himself has been doing some theft, but there's probably others who've stolen much, much more, and who have probably made their exit from Ukraine already by whatever means they can pay for. But his survival is pegged to being the man who can deliver the money and the weapons. The money looking like now it was there to pay people off. The weapons, it's a big PR thing. It's a big morale booster, apparently, for those Ukrainians who still believe in the regime, that Zelensky's bringing the F-16, Zelensky's bringing the Leopard 2, Zelensky's bringing the Challenger 2, Zelensky's bringing the M1 Abrams, etc., etc. It's all about essentially generating positive press for him, and that he's demanding all of this now. Like, he must, unless he's really stupid and just so coke-addled that sense has left him, even he must understand after 2 years of war that even if the British and the Germans and the French just gave the rest of all of their tank fleets to Ukraine, it might make the Russians work a little bit harder for maybe a few weeks, but it wouldn't change the trajectory of the war at all, for all the reasons that people like Jacques Beau have specified. So again, we come back to the sickening image of Tony Blinken doing bad cover versions of Neil Young in a Kiev club, where presumably with its own generator as the power in the rest of the country goes out. And I think that it's the perfect horrific image for this whole thing, which is that this is like they have engaged in this horrible, keeping this horrific facade going for so long. And again, like we have to go back and we have to look at like why on earth were the Ukrainians ordered to fight in the way that they have been? Because the Ukrainians have consistently fought in ways that really don't suit, it seems to me, their situation. So let's go back to, if we go back to 2 years ago, we can say that, of course, in it would have been far better for the Ukrainians to actually make that peace deal in April of 2022. But of course, that didn't happen for reasons we've gone into ad nauseum before, so we won't again. But let's think about the various offensives the Ukrainians carried out at enormous cost. So we go back to the Kharkov offensive, where the Russians simply withdrew. You can call that a victory of sorts. I mean, they compelled a Russian withdrawal. There was an initial Kherson offensive earlier than that, which was repelled at great cost to the Ukrainians. Then, after the Kharkov offensive, they spent months and months and months telling the Russians where they wanted to go, which was the Zaporozhye region, telling them that this was the big offensive, this was the big one, the hammer blow is coming, etc., etc., etc. And they went exactly where they said they were going to go, in exactly the way that the Russians thought they would, and got slaughtered as a result. And you have to ask yourself, well, why on earth are they fighting that way? Given that the Russians were in a dilemma in autumn of 2022. The entire way that the Russians had organized their force in February of 2022 was designed to, as I've said before, force the Georgian scenario, which is, of course, the 2008 scenario, which is a rapid advance. The enemy gets shocked into signing a peace deal, and then essentially an uneasy peace then reigns. Like the Ukrainians lose Donetsk and Luhansk, and they have to live with that, and they sign a peace deal with the Russians, and that would be the end of that. So the Russians fought, but of course they made a mistake in that they underestimated the determination, or should I say the desperation, of the US imperialists and their European allies / vassals / cringing supplicants they underestimated their determination to use this as a way to try and destroy the Putin-led government. So they had to reorganize themselves. So after the Kharkov victory, it's the Ukrainians did have a chance to reorganize themselves, dig in, and defend what they had back then, and force then perhaps the Russians to go on the offensive. And again, like if their aim was to increase the pressure on Putin, then why play to the Russian strengths when the Russians, from the bringing in of Surovikin as overall commander of the special military operation, until he was reshuffled out following the Prigozhin affair, when everybody could see, the US could certainly see via its incredibly extensive satellite coverage, the defensive lines the Russians were building. Why on earth would you then organize an offensive, throwing Ukrainian forces at the parts in a section of the Russian defenses which were the strongest? Why do that? Why on earth would you get the Ukrainians to do that? Again, like, it doesn't make any sense. The only way it makes sense is if the officers putting that together, and this is the NATO officers I'm talking about here, I'm sure that Zaluzny and co. Did know that this was going to lead to disaster, but this was a NATO plan. This was principally, I think, a US, British, and French plan. The idea that they were going to storm all the way to the sea, and the only way they could storm all the way to the sea is if the Russians up sticks and ran away, which they have never shown any sign of doing. Again, the only way you could believe that the Russians were going to just simply run away is if you believe that that's what they had done in Kharkov, in the Kharkov region. Well, they didn't. They didn't run away. They carried out an orderly withdrawal, which did cost them in terms of casualties, but the Ukrainians lost far more on that advance than the Russians lost by their withdrawal. So to believe that the Russians would simply run away, you would have to be just high on your own fumes. It is a very strange thing that these military officers and the intelligence agencies came to believe it, because even if, and I think this is absolutely true, we regard their treatment of the Ukrainians as cynical and horrific, which is correct. It is cynical and it is horrific what they have done to the Ukrainians and what the Ukrainian compradors have done to their own nation. But from the point of view of the imperialists, they were looking for this knockout blow against the Putin regime. They were looking for this spectacular victory that would destabilize the Putin government, lead to some sort of internal collapse or palace coup or something. That's what they were after. But they went about it in such a way as to essentially play to all of the Russian strengths. So they, having known the extensive Russian fortifications that had been built, they then ordered the Ukrainians to hurl themselves against it, again with little to no air power, throwing tanks into minefields that they knew had been created. And predictably, the tanks got stuck and blown up, and the Ukrainians barely even seized one village, or a few villages that consisted of a population of barely a few hundred people. They didn't even get past the first proper line of the Surovikin line. So again, the tactics that the NATO commanders have dictated to the Ukrainians to use have consistently been abysmal, based on the completely erroneous idea that the Russian army would just up and run away. Now, that might have been true, a reasonable calculation, if we were dealing with the Russian army of 1994, or perhaps even 1996 in Chechnya, but it hasn't been true from the later 90s in the Second Chechen War. It hasn't been true in the short war against Georgia. It's not been true in the admittedly rather different conditions of Syria. So why on earth did they think that the Russians would up and run away on territory that they now regard, or many Russians now regard, as their own, when the Russian population, according to surveys even done by bourgeois outlets in the West, the opinions of ordinary Russians are, regardless of their opinion of the Putin government, are solidly behind it when it comes to the special military operation. Why on earth did they think that the Russians would just crumble and run away? Again, you would have to be high on your own supply, to quote Tony Montana, to a degree that is hard to understand. But again, this is what the NATO officers and the NATO politicians, people like Tony Blinken, have decided that the Ukrainians should do: hurl themselves against Russian defenses, die in huge numbers, and defend every square inch of territory to the point of ridiculousness, to the point where the Ukrainians lose thousands and thousands of men in places like Avdiivka or Artyomovsk, or up in the Kharkov region now, where they try and defend every square inch they possibly can. They don't make tactical withdrawals. They don't move to more defensive positions. They just stay and try to not take one step back, like, the Nazis in the post-1943 period of World War II. So this is all bizarre, to say the least. Even if you look at this through the lens of the complete cynicism of the imperialists, that they were just using and are just using the Ukrainians as a tool to wield against the Russians. Well, again, even from that point of view, the tactics they've pursued don't make any sense. And you have to reach the conclusion that the leadership, both political and military, in the NATO countries, particularly the US, Britain, France, etc., these people are not just cynical and brutish, but completely out of touch with reality. Even if your perspective is that you are pursuing as a strategy the destabilization and overthrow of the Putin-led system in Russia. Okay, let's say that is the point of view that you are adopting, and that you are using Ukraine to achieve these ends. Okay, let's put ourselves in the mindset of our enemy for a moment. So, how would you do it? How would you go about it? How would you destabilize that system? By mad dashes to the Black Sea? By telegraphing an offensive for 6 months before it happens? I mean, to answer to a point that's been made in the comments, the arrogance and foolishness of these people is staggering. Is staggering. You assume that when you live in the imperialist countries, that they are lying constantly to you via the bourgeois press. You assume that everything they say publicly is false or is a gross distortion of reality. So you grow up to understand that once you start to understand basics of Marxism. But you assume, perhaps wrongly, that there is, on some level, somewhere, the truth is known inside these organizations, inside the British Ministry of Defense, inside MI6, inside the CIA, that there are people that know the truth, and I think they are. Truth is known in these organizations, but again, this doesn't seem to filter through to the decision makers, or they're so far gone on arrogance and foolishness and complacency now that they've completely lost touch with reality, even to the point where they're no longer able to effectively pursue their own objectives. Because if your objective was to spin this out and cost the Russian government blood and treasure, so to speak, then surely your point of view should have been to, well, we have to make the Russians attack entrenched Ukrainian positions and cost them large numbers of casualties, and then that would you stymie the Russians then and cost them large numbers of men killed, and that would probably be a much better way of destabilizing things in Russia than playing to the traditional strengths of the Russian army and hurling your poorly organized, barely integrated force at them over and over and over again, or getting your proxy force to stand and fight until the last Ukrainian, in the belief that suddenly the Russians are just going to give up and go home. I mean, from the point of view of my own political development, the war in Ukraine, the special military operation, has been probably the most crucial thing to happen to the development of my own understanding of imperialism, and certainly probably since the Iraq War itself 20 years ago. Because what you come to see is that it's not only the case that the system is cynical and brutal, but what the special military operation taught me is the way that the ruling class in Britain is so far gone on its own propaganda now. They're so far gone in the belief in their own supremacy that reality can't intrude. I think that this is certainly the case with the political and media figures. I think it's the case with the ruling class themselves, the actual capitalist class in Britain, because they just seem to have no idea of the actual reality of the government of Putin, the multiple governments that Putin has run, the evolution of Russian economic policy over the last 20 years, even though this information is all publicly available. Any bourgeois politician can pick up a book by Richard Sakwa or Richard Connolly and analyze this for themselves, if any of them indeed are capable of reading. That's questionable. So this is the great revelation, is that not only are they dangerously deluded when it comes to their own superiority. I mean, how they can continue to believe this after the gigantic disaster of 2008, I don't know. I think it's a combination of the fact that the domestic proletariat hasn't challenged them seriously in decades, and they think that they got away with 2008. They didn't. It fatally weakened them. But again, we are in the age of great hubris, and this is leading them to the point where they will suffer a disaster. And the question then for us is, well, what happens then? Where does the bourgeoisie take its aggression out on? The domestic working class, or do they try and go on the offensive in terms of their chosen enemies, or their necessary enemies, I should say, the Russians and the Chinese in particular? Or do they simply try to restore profitability by launching a devastating attack on the working class here? All of these things are in the mix. It's probably going to be some kind of mixture of all of the above. But we'll get to that we'll get to a further discussion of that in just a moment. So, disaster up in Kharkov, continued Russian advances in the Donbass region, the attempts by the Ukrainian forces under the influence of the British and the American intelligence services to launch strikes on Crimea, strikes into Belgorod, might have caused damage, but they've given them nothing in terms of military achievements. And you have to say that what's been revealed is that the officer corps of the US and the British Army and the French Army is quite simply no good. These people can't plan shit. They're used to running military operations where they essentially go around shooting peasants in the Afghan mountains or the Iraqi deserts or the deserts of the Sahel, where they can go around and brutalize poorly armed people or people with no weaponry at all and call themselves winners. But of course, they're not winners even there because they lost in Afghanistan. The French got driven out of Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, the Americans, of course, lost in Iraq. That's why they employed the services of ISIS. They lost in Afghanistan. So these are just terminal losers. Like these great titans of Western imperialism. And not only are they complacent, not only are they foolish, but they're losers. Like they're intellectuals now. And if we use the intellectuals in the old Gramscian sense, which is those who do the thinking and the calculating and the designing of the schemes of the bourgeois, their specialists are no good. Their intelligence men aren't any good anymore. Their officer corps is useless. Their systems are falling apart. So this is an undoubted disaster, and a disaster which has been brought about by the deep rot of the imperialist system in the West, and that rot filtering up into the base, going into the superstructure, and creating people who are just far gone on chauvinism and stupidity and dull-witted arrogance, to the point where they have not only caused a disaster and caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands, maybe, if you, depending upon which set of figures you believe, possibly over 1 million Ukrainians now dead, and in pursuit of an objective they've got nowhere near. So not only are these people cruel, they're also stupid, the worst combination of all, and made stupid by the long-term crisis of their system. All right, checking in on comments now, and thanks to all 220 of you watching at the moment. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Right, where are we now? Got a lot of comments coming here now. Right. Hector says NATO still has sniper grannies in reserve. I don't think they've even got them anymore. Hello to Cobra Commander, who has joined us. Almir says, Ukrainian casualties are straight up horrific, over 1 million dead and seriously wounded. Yes, certainly are. Boyo says, blows my mind the size of the theft. The billions of tax dollars privatized into the corporate bank accounts via Ukraine, probably stashed back in the United States, or perhaps a Swiss bank account. Be interesting to see how many of the Ukrainian elite have fled. We know that some have, but be interesting to see where are the old Ukrainian oligarchs these days. We should really track them down. Cobra Commander says, if America doesn't have air superiority, there's nothing they can really do but throw money. America can't win a ground war with Russia or China. Well, exactly. Zain Mudassir says there's a lot of wastefulness in Western military systems. Defense contractors make huge profits. Yeah, they were dealing with a sort of late stage monopoly capitalism where not only is innovation stymied, but also waste is not is the feature, not the bug, to use an Americanism. They are because of the way that these defense contractors are structured. They're structured just to extract as much money out of the contract as possible, not to produce usable military hardware. There's an interesting page I saw online recently of like cancelled US defense systems that could have been useful, but were cancelled because they didn't make enough money, basically. And there's a very good book by one of the Coburn clan. It might be, it's not Patrick Coburn, it's one of his brothers from a couple of years ago now, which chronicles this. I'll have to dig it out and do a review of it. Cobra Commander observes, we're due a bust. Well, we've been in a long depression for, well, 15, 16 years since 2008, maybe long as 17 years now. There's been no real growth of any real kind in Britain or the United States. Since the crash of 07, 08, it's been staggering along like a zombie, essentially. But you're right, a big crash is due very soon. Michael says, Pentagon Wars, free on YouTube about the Bradley fighting vehicle is worth an hour or two. Funny and informative. Interesting. I'll make a note of that. Hello to Abtin, who joins us. Hello to YepX, who has joined us. Let's see. Right. Ukraine tried to do Sherman March to the sea, but got defeated, but didn't get anywhere near the sea. Not a pacifist says Ukraine wins on the PS4, possibly. Zelensky's been playing Call of Duty constantly and thinks that they've won. Yepek says most free-letter agencies are not your friends. Some would argue that all of them are your enemy. Well, all of the agencies of the state are. They are the agencies of the class enemy. They're set up FBI, CIA, ATF, NSA, MI6, MI5. Name your three-letter agency. They're all designed. They're all integral parts of the bourgeois state machine. They're designed to perpetuate the rule of the capitalist class, domestically and internationally. So nobody should put any elements of trust in those agencies to do anything other than the exact job that they're there for, that they've been designed for, which is to perpetuate the rule of capital. Zain Mudassir says Russians stood and fought with great courage. Very true. Bart loves the word comprador. It's a great word. I'm glad we brought it back. Hello to Robert Svorinich, who joins us. The Western imperialists, says David, are brought up to believe they are superior to the Russians. Why would they not be arrogant? Yes, I think the point I was making there was that you expect arrogance and you expect propaganda, but you expect that on some level they do understand the truth. And it seems that the political leadership really don't know. So I've been surprised and never in good ways about the capabilities of the bourgeoisie. They are useless and arrogant at the same time. You'd think the arrogance would have been knocked out of them by now, but it's still there. There's no one more arrogant than the British ruling class. Even the American ruling class aren't as arrogant as the British, but the British really don't deserve to be anymore. I mean, they've been living off the clipping of coupons for over 100 years now, killing their own manufacturing base and just turning to pure parasitism. And the arrogance of these people is astonishing, given that they just live off the moving around of capital now. You ever meet any members or even people who are close to the British ruling class, like their immediate servants, like the arrogance, complacency, and stupidity are their defining features. Where are we now? Sean says the point of war is not to win the war. The point is to profit from the war. I disagree. There is always a point. And the point of this war was to make the Russian system collapse. The point of this war and the point of their attempted creation of a war with China is to make both systems collapse. So the point is to win that war. But they are constrained in what they can do. Hence why they ran an outsourced war. They thought that they could trigger a crisis in the Russian political superstructure by creating these problems in the east of Ukraine. That's what it was designed for, what the coup was designed for 10 years ago. It's what this whole thing has been designed for. And they thought that they could do it once this special military operation began. They underestimated the Russians chronically. So there is a point to this war. The point was to collapse the Russian government and then to either impose a comprador regime or break up the country completely so that all of the Russian resources could be unrestrictedly looted. That was the point of the war. They haven't secured that. They haven't been able to win that. Yes, some bourgeois will make money from this. Of course they will. But overall, where the wars that you mentioned, like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, all of those wars, yes, certain capitalists made bank on them. But overall, the position of US imperialism after each of these wars was weaker because they did fail to achieve their objectives. They failed to crush the revolution in Vietnam, the national liberation movement in Vietnam. They failed to control Iraq. They failed to control Afghanistan. The fact that so many corrupt bastards were making money off all of them, yes, that's disgusting, but we should not be mistaken here. Imperialism failed in all of those places to achieve the long-term objectives. Again, the long-term objective that they really wanted in Iraq and Afghanistan was a compliant stooge regime, a compliant comprador regime that would essentially run the country on behalf of the United States, that would be a calm puppet state, which would enable them to strategically dominate the West Asia for another century. Hence why they called their think tank in the 90s that came up with all these ideas, the Project for a New American Century. The New American Century would be defined by retaining their dominant position in Europe, making sure that the EU never developed into a strategic rival. They succeeded in that. But also to make sure that they completely dominated West Asia for reasons of control of the oil, but also to strategically position themselves against the Russians and the Chinese. And if they could dominate West Asia for the next century, then you would have another American century. That was their plan. They failed to achieve that plan. Yes, this is what we should always remember. Certain members of the ruling class will continue making large amounts of money, even off defeat, right up to the point where imperialism collapses. Every single war that they have fought and that they have lost, as I said, individual capitalists have made money off it. Individual corrupt officials have pocketed loads of cash and fucked off to a mansion in the Maryland suburbs or something, or the Virginia suburbs. That happens. But each time in these wars, they have lost and they have been defeated and they have been weakened. Same will be true in Ukraine. A lot of people in the United States, a relatively small number in the grand scheme of things, but quite a decent sized number, will make money off this war. They will make money in various different ways: weapons deals, selling of Ukrainian assets, outright theft. But again, when the Russians win and when the US imperialists are seen to be defeated again, their position globally will be weakened. Their scalped allies in Europe will be weakened further. Their imperial bloc, represented by the G7, will be seen as being defeated. And it will only lead to a deterioration of their position. So I would say we should not mistake individual capitalists or corporations cashing in on war with success in that war. These wars were all meant to achieve an overall strategic aim for US imperialism, and they failed in all of them. Never forget that. Western hubris will be the West's downfall. Well, yes, the hubris stemming from the long-term crisis will be their downfall. The Russian Federation must inherit Ukraine, says Abtin. Be serious about integrating it, or this madness will never end. Well, this will be. I think this has now become obvious to the Russian leadership. I mean, I said that there might be the possibility of some kind of deal where some kind of like Western Bandera theme park survives. I don't think that they're going to accept that now. So whatever Ukrainian state emerges from this will be tied to the Russian Federation and Belarus, more likely. I don't think they're going to allow the West any presence in Ukraine now. Any deal disappeared years ago. Any potential for a deal has long since disappeared. The aim of the imperialists now is just to spin out the war as far as they possibly can. And the Russians will then, of course, do what they need to do to secure victory. I think they possibly will resurrect some form of Ukraine, but it'll be one without large areas that were in Ukraine prior to 2014. Luca says, about the SMO, it was an eye-opener for me too. When in crisis, the ruling class show their true face. The double standard when the situation in West Asia escalated was just a further confirmation. Yes. I mean, to turn to the Israel question, when asked recently, the intern at the State Department, who is wheeled out to do to tell the lies that John Kirby can't be bothered telling. When asked about the International Criminal Court, he says, "Well, we don't see it has any right to jurisdiction over the case of Israel, but we'll work with it when it comes to Ukraine." So, I mean, again, like basically just demonstrating exactly what's going on, which is that the International Criminal Court is regarded as legitimate when it goes after the enemies of the US imperialists. When it even looks like it's going to go after their number one colony, then they will threaten to destroy it, often physically. So again, the entire waking world, the entire conscious world, the proletariat of all the Western nations are now have this on screen before them. The advanced workers are learning from this. The advanced workers can see the hypocrisies and the lies, and that's why, of course, we as communists shouldn't be ashamed at all to link what's going on in Israel with what's going on in Ukraine. The two are very much bound up together. Now, I think that the Palestinian National Liberation Forces would have launched an operation regardless of whether the Russians were involved in the special military operation or not. It was necessitated by the severity of the situation. But the fact that it came when the US forces were losing in Ukraine, the fact that it came when the Israelis were complacent and arrogant to the point of utter stupidity. The fact that it rapidly exposed the true face of imperialism when they were saying that the Russians were carrying out a genocide of the civilian population, when the Russians were and are taking every effort to avoid civilian damage, and then to have Biden openly backing a carpet bombing job in Gaza when accusing the Russians of doing that, which it's clear that the Russians haven't been doing that. It's a revealing moment, and it opens up the possibility for the working class to begin a real political education on what the nature of the regimes that rule us actually are. Jeremy says, I'm wondering if there is any resistance from the Ukrainian working class, not the conscripts, but others, or are they supportive of their government? It's difficult to tell, given that there's now many cases that could have been confirmed of Ukrainian men resisting the conscription officers of that was that guy that blew himself up with a grenade rather than be taken. There was an alleged assassination plot against Zelensky that seems to have been real anyway. It seems to have been there was some kind of plot there. The fact that all those who fled to Europe, all the men that fled to Europe, aren't going to want to return. There's no, I mean, if the Ukrainians and the European governments try to round these guys up and send them back to Ukraine, they're not going to want to go. They're going to run away. They're going to resist. They're going to use whatever connections that they've made in these countries to resist their return to Ukraine. So it's going to be very difficult if the Germans, the Poles, try and carry out like mass deportations of Ukrainian men. It's going to cause a lot of problems because the bulk of them are just not going to want to go back. So it's difficult to tell the level of resistance because we don't have much reliable information other than the leaks from like the various Ukrainian Telegram channels. The fact that like the Ukrainian working class got politically crushed a long time ago means that we can't see a lot of resistance there at the moment. I'm sure there are things going on though, and we'll learn more about it when this comes to a close. Luca says it was about at the same time that I came across your channel, and once you see the system true, the lens of Marxism, Leninism, then you connect all the dots. Well, happy to provide the service or open the door, shall we say. I wonder if the USA looks at dead Ukrainians, asks Bart, the same as dead Palestinians. They look at anybody who dies in the service or in the defense of the interests of US imperialism as worth it. Bear in mind, the ruling class in the United States don't look at the US working class as humans. The British ruling class don't look at the British working class as human and never have. So it should be no surprise that they don't, the deaths of millions of Ukrainians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, hundreds of thousands of Afghans, that doesn't even register. It doesn't even make these people like blink. And neither really would the deaths of millions of working class Americans or British people. The only reason why this is not done, the reason why they don't do mass conscription and packing off American workers in uniform and British workers in uniform over to Ukraine to die in vast numbers is because they're terrified of the results that would happen if they did. The reason why we don't have conscription, and unless things deteriorate more for the ruling class, they won't do conscription because they are very afraid of it. They've not brought in, bear in mind, they didn't conscription all the way through the war on terror period, even when things got dicey in Iraq, precisely because the military rebellions of the Vietnam period still frighten the ruling class in the United States. And I think they are aware on some level of just how weak their hold is becoming, just how despised they're becoming. And so they fear what would happen in a conscription situation. But that fear is the only reason why they don't, again, reintroduce conscription and pack off millions of Americans to die fighting the Russians, partly because of fear of internal rebellion and partly out of fear that they would lose and lose very badly. So again, like the death of workers in the imperial core countries barely registers with them. Again, only fear stops them from sacrificing millions of us. So the deaths of the people in the periphery or in the colonized nations or in the neocolonial world, again, it will barely register. Luca says, no wonder true political education is not provided. I would have thought, like you, that the people at the top knew what they were doing, but it's probably only a very small minority. Very few do. I mean, I can understand why they don't want intelligent politicians, but you would think you would want some. But I think the fact is now that the arrogance of victory has made them stupid. They thought they'd won this big victory, and they did win a victory in 1991. The counter-revolution was a huge victory for them, but it wasn't really one that they earned. It was more one that they were given by the failures of the other side and the treachery of the revisionists. And so they've just been telling themselves how great they are for 30 years. And it's no wonder in those sort of that atmosphere of arrogance and closed-mindedness that the intellectuals of the ruling class, the intellectuals they're producing, just degenerate to the point of incapacity. Almir says they backed off Iran because they would have to fight themselves and they would lose. That's true. I mean, why has Israel done nothing or next to nothing against Iran? Because Iran made it clear that they could hit Israel and hurt it, and could hit the US and hurt them. And if that happened, that would be an enormous blow to US imperialism if they were revealed to be incapable of fighting the Iranians, which they are incapable of fighting the Iranians. And so they basically, the US told the Israelis, that's it, draw a line under it. Go back to murdering the Palestinians en masse. We'll cover you for that. But this gambit with Iran isn't going any further. And so they gave Netanyahu his orders when it came to that, and he had to suck it up. So anybody who tells you that the US isn't in control of Israel is lying or being very, very foolish. Because when it came to Iran, the Israelis tried something, tried a gamble. They went after the Iranian diplomatic representation, probably thinking that the Iranians wouldn't respond directly. But of course, Iran had to. And then when Iran did, and hit what they were aiming for with a very high degree of accuracy, and did cause the damage to the places they wanted to cause damage to, and did show that they could overwhelm the air defense systems, not just of Israel, but also those provided by the US and the British imperialists and the French imperialists and their Jordanian puppet. When they showed all of that, the US told Netanyahu, you're not going any further with it. You can go and invade Rafah, but you're not going any further with this Iran business. And Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir and all the others had to just suck it up, because that was the order. So again, when it comes to it, the US imperialists can order their colony around. It's just that most of the time they're choosing not to. Why? And again, I'll repeat something I've said on many occasions before. If the US imperialists did what the student protesters in the United States are demanding, or some of them are demanding, correctly demanding a ceasefire. If the US imposed a ceasefire on the situation, says, hey, Benjamin, right, time's up, mate. No more guns, no more money, ceasefire now, or we go and put our name to a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire that's going to go through the Security Council, and we'll back up sanctions on you if you don't abide by it. But if you don't follow the orders, no more political, economic, or military support will be coming your way. Assume that they did that. Well, then the Israelis would try to sustain the war themselves and fail, and then the Israeli regime would fall apart, which means that the US's position in West Asia would be fatally compromised, and then the whole game would be over. So this is why, of course, they are stuck. They can't say no to the Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. Biden's crew is desperate to pretend that they're doing something to stop it when they're not. But they know very well that if Israel loses, or if Israel is forced to stop this, then if the Netanyahu government falls, then only political chaos will follow, and a weakening of the Israeli state, which is already looking very shaky. Hassan Nasrallah is right, which is that when he says that the Israelis are committing a lot of murders, but they're losing, and they know they're losing. Even ex-Israeli military officials are openly saying that they are losing. So the US is stuck. They can't go forward. They can't force this ceasefire, which people are saying, well, why doesn't the Biden administration force a ceasefire? If they do that, then it's not just that Netanyahu is finished, it's that the political superstructure in Israel becomes fatally compromised and falls to pieces. And if that happens, again, the US position and British position in West Asia is incredibly badly damaged, and would probably see the end of their presence in that area of the world probably within a decade. It would be a massive crisis, far worse than what happened to British imperialism in Egypt in 1956 in the Suez Crisis. So bear this in mind every time you see the US essentially backing up the genocide. what they're doing is they're backing up the genocide because this is the blood price for them maintaining their position in West Asia. And of course, it's a blood price they are willing to have the Palestinians pay for. But ultimately, for all the blood and slaughter, for all the murder, it's ultimately a struggle that is being lost. Although, says Luca, in a Michael Parenti video I was watching today, he said, because you won't know what they are doing, it doesn't mean that they don't know what they are doing. Well, yes, I mean, I think when Parenti made those videos, the US system was run by more calculating, ruthless, and intelligent characters like George H.W. Bush. A lot of these characters at the top don't know what the fuck they're doing. The plan, we would go back to the plan regarding Ukraine. The actual plan, which was the destabilization operation against the Russians, the people who designed that did know what they were doing. People like Victoria Nuland understood what she was doing. And the reason why she hung around the State Department for 20 plus years is because she was an effective operator who knew what she was fighting for, who people say, oh, was Nuland's attitude because she had family origins in Ukraine? Nuland never gave a fuck about Ukraine. Let's be perfectly clear about this. Even if she had some family origins in the area, or that like Blinken's grandfather or something came from Kiev, I think, when it was in a city of the old Tsarist Empire. People like Nuland and the rest of like the Ukrainian second or third generation exiles in the United States, do you think they really give a fuck about Ukraine? They don't. These are dedicated servants of US imperialism. People like Victoria Nuland and others, they're the ones who do understand what they're doing to a degree. They are the ones who designed this policy for the specific purpose of destroying, ultimately, the government of the Russian Federation or destroying the Russian Federation itself. Why? Well, is Nuland motivated by wild hatred for Russia because of her familial origins? Well, maybe on some level, but that's not why she's doing it. She's doing it because she's a dedicated career servant of US imperialism, as are many of the others in the State Department, CIA, and Department of Defense who design these programs. These people are the intellectuals. Someone like Tony Blinken is a front man. Joe Biden is a front man. The people who make the serious decisions are those like Victoria Nuland. So she and others like her did understand what they were doing when they designed this plan. What they failed to understand was that they failed to take into account the strengths of the Putin system and the evolution of that system over time. They made a fatal error in that they didn't do a proper assessment of the true strengths and weaknesses of their opponent. So the plan, they understood completely what the plan was, but they were basing it on very outdated assumptions, and that's why it failed. Yu Wan joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to you. Sean Moon asked, did they really believe that Ukraine was going to win a land war with Russia? They didn't mean that. I don't think they thought that Ukraine would actually defeat Russia properly in a land war. What Ukraine was supposed to do, and if you look at the way that the Donbass war was conducted from 2014 to 2022, what was actually meant to happen is, as far as I can tell, was this. They did build a lot of defenses in Donetsk, especially. And they did, I think the American military were involved in building these. So the idea was that they would have, they would eventually provoke either a Russian invasion, in which case they hoped that what would happen was that the mega sanctions, as Biden himself said, hey, we're going to reduce the ruble to rubble, man. Collapsing the ruble via the sanctions regime, cutting off the Russian bourgeois' ability to move their money into Europe and the United States, stealing the Russian assets, cutting off Russian trade with Europe in particular. What was meant to happen with that is once you triggered the wider war, then the combined impact of that and the sanctions were meant to cause a complete economic collapse. And the way the war was meant to go was that the Ukrainians would stymie the Russians. Not that the Ukrainians would be on some glorious march to Moscow or something like that. The actual job they were supposed to do was to just inflict enough casualties on the Russians to make sure that the sanctions could do their work. So the role of the Ukrainians in this was always to fight and die in large numbers, to play their part in securing the bigger objective, which is to stymie the Russian forces, to give the time to for the sanctions regime to do its job. And the idea being that you cause an economic collapse. At the same time, the war in Ukraine looks like it is not going well. And this is part of the reason why they keep doing these like supposedly spectacular assaults. So like, why do they keep shelling Belgorod? Why do they keep sending like exiled Russian fascists to do raids over the border? It's not because they expect the Russians to just completely disappear and for these guys to march all the way to Moscow and, kill Putin or something. It's that they hope that by doing these raids on Belgorod and doing these raids on Crimea, they hope to turn that into a media package and provoke panic in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So again, to go back to the plan, the plan was supposed to be either they provoked the Russians into launching a war, which is what happened, or I should say, expanding the war that had already been going on for 8 years back in 2022. And that this would enable the mega sanctions to hit. And that what the Ukrainians needed to do was to make sure that the war went badly enough for the Russians to intensify a crisis that would be economic and therefore, of course, political, and that there would be a revolt inside Russia. This was meant to be fueled by the various different NGO-type operations that are aligned with various liberal Russian oligarchs, who, of course, the Russian comprador bourgeoisie and their political organizations were meant to go into action. You saw this early on in Moscow and St. Petersburg with the supposedly anti-war protesters, who are, of course, representative of actually very few people inside Russia. So what was meant to unfold was an economic crisis. What was meant to also unfold was something that could be presented at least as a military disaster for the Russians at the front. All of that combines together to produce a revolt of the Russian bourgeoisie, or a revolt of the military or security officials inside the Putin system, to secure the overthrow of Putin and the bringing in of an out-and-out comprador regime that would sign a surrender over Ukraine. And if that led to complete destabilization and collapse of the Russian Federation, well, that'd be even better. So the role the Ukrainians were actually meant to play in this was limited to being able to stymie the Russians on the battlefield. Or if the Russians refused to move in 2022, if they refused to take any action, to flatten Donbass completely, to unleash the fascist forces on a conquered Donbass, and to engage in all manner of grisly crimes there. And if that happened, then that would also provoke a crisis inside of legitimacy for the Putin system and Putin himself, because he would have stood aside and allowed people who were asking to join the Russian Federation, who'd been asking for the protection of the Russian Federation. Putin would have been seen to have allowed them to suffer and die under the boot heel of NATO-backed fascists. So the idea was that they would win either way. They would win by provoking an invasion, which would not go well, and then the mega sanctions would collapse the Russian economy, and they would mobilize their color revolution forces, or there would be a revolt of the elites against Putin, thus securing victory for them that way. Or if Putin crumbled and refused to take action, then the grotesque crimes that would be committed by the Kiev regime against the Donbass population would also provoke a crisis inside Russia. So the idea was that they would have Putin coming and going. He would be damned if he did and damned if he didn't. And that's why they were confident, because again, like, it was never based on the idea that Ukraine would have to fight a long war with the Russians. It was meant to just be able to fight a war that would be going on for like 3 months at the most, I think. And then the rest of the work would be done by sanctions and political operations inside Russia. Right. Chenish says, many Russian leftists are skeptical about the Russian ruling class and don't believe that Russian comprador bourgeoisie cannot stand for national interests, but it seems government of the Russian Federation learned lessons. Well, I would say that what's happened is a lot of Russian leftists are, it seems that they still think that the compradors are in full charge. They're not. What you have is a Bonapartist regime that it has taken quite a great deal of political power away from the compradors. They are allowed to keep their property. They're allowed to move their money around. But the level of power they had back under Yeltsin has very severely diminished. So this Bonapartist system runs now in such a way as to be able to essentially tell the compradors when that they have to suck things up, basically. David Matthews says NATO won in Serbia. They did, basically thanks to the fact that Yeltsin betrayed Milosevic for reasons we've gone into before. They got a limited victory, but I think in the end it will prove to be a victory that doesn't last long term. We can go into that in future episodes. Not a pacifist said, I've been reading Xi Jinping speeches and writings from 2012 onwards. The Chinese are 10 times as smart and disciplined as Western leaders and have been for decades. I would say also, when you're reading something by President Xi or any Chinese leader, always remember that they are the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, as well as being the president. So Xi, when he speaks or writes, is speaking for the established political line of the CPC and the wider political trajectory of the People's Republic of China, as decided through the PRC's democratic systems. So again, you're not just, I'm sure you know this, I'm just saying for the wider audience, when you read Xi's works, he's speaking for the considered line of the party and the political line decided for the state by the democratic structures of the state. What Xi says is far more representative of what opinions are in China than what any Western leader says regarding opinions inside the West. So the Chinese system is far more representative of the Chinese population than any system in the West is representative of us. Where are we now? Putin's shirt says one of the Washington think tanks also misjudged China. I read a report that said they believe China would never back Russia because of China's non-intervention policy. Well, China hasn't actually intervened as such. They've just continued to trade with the Russians. And again, they made a massive miscalculation because they thought that the Chinese would actually back away from what had been for a 20-year-long process of building better and better relations with the Russian Federation. And I mean, again, like they actually thought that the Chinese would listen to them when the US imperialists had already made their pivot to Asia, specifically for the purposes of engineering setbacks for the Chinese in their own region, as early as like 2009-10. So again, like they'd been pushing a certain policy which had forced an escalation of the relationship between the Russians and the Chinese. And then they thought the Chinese would actually listen to them. And again, like this is after the Hong Kong scenarios that played out in 2018 to 2019, after all the dirty business that the US and the British and others had been up to in Xinjiang, all the provocations that they'd engaged in against the Chinese, and the fact that the Chinese quite seriously believed that the COVID outbreak was a bioweapon brought into their country by the United States. So given all of that, it's a horrific miscalculation to think that the Chinese would be in the mood to actually listen to the or pay heed to the agenda of the US. Again, like a massive miscalculation, if that is indeed what they thought. But it seems that they did miscalculate there again. Eric Parcells says there's a mythology in the West. The Afghan intervention of the 1980s was what brought down a sclerotic Soviet economy, and Ukraine proxy wars to create the same pressures. That's true. Again, it's a misunderstanding of history. Again, remember what Hillary Clinton said just 2 days into the invasion, that we're going to turn this into another Afghanistan for the Russians. Again, no one's stupider than an imperial functionary who thinks she's some sort of genius. Right, okay. Chinish says, question, what to read in English to get some more inside information about China? I mean, periodic reading, interior politics, intellectual discussions, things like this. Well, I'll start by recommending reading the collected works of Xi Jinping himself. If you can get these as PDFs online now, but I mean, I invested in the books, and I think it's very, very much a worthy investment because it's something that you can start to learn what the different positions are and what the developing line is of the CPC via reading Xi's comments. Particularly interesting are his comments on and his speeches and writings on the development of the party, the links of the party with the masses, the development of democratic systems in China. Very, very interesting to see how it develops over the last 12 years since he rose to become the paramount leader in the Chinese system. So I would recommend the works of Xi himself to start off with. Okay, right. It is after the midnight hour here in Britain, so I'm going to draw this one to a close for this evening. Thank you to all 250 of you watching at the moment. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. I hope that you can join me tomorrow night at the same time, 10:30 British time, for the next episode of our series on the works of Stalin, and that is Stalin's collected works on the opposition. So that will be 10:30 tomorrow. And what I'll do with that one, that'll be a pre-recorded video. So it'll be me talking about this this particular work of Stalin's for the first half hour and 40 to 45 minutes or so. And then once the pre-recorded video ends, I'll then be taking questions on it for the next hour or so after that, or however long we need to. So join me tomorrow, 10:30, same place, same time, etc. Until then, thank you for watching, and you can find the audio version of this program on the Patreon site from tomorrow. See you again soon.